There are secrets that the earth holds better than any vault. Hank Miller arrived in the small town of Cedar Ridge one September afternoon, when the sun tinged the mountains in the distance, and the dust of the main road was still dancing in the warm air. He was a man of robust build, with hands calloused by hard work, and eyes that carried the fatigue of one who had seen cities born and die in the West. He came from afar, driving a wagon loaded with all his possessions, which were not many, but enough to start over once more. The city seemed asleep at that time of day. A few women swept the porches of their homes, children played in the dusty street, and men gathered in front of the general store, discussing the prices of cattle and the rains that stubbornly did not arrive. Hank stopped his wagon in front of the small bank and got off, shaking the dust off his clothes. His eyes scanned the main street, watching every detail with the attention of someone who had learned to read the signs of a place before settling on it. The bank manager, a short, nervous man named Peterson, greeted him with professional courtesy, but Hank noticed the way his eyes assessed his simple clothes and his traveler-like appearance. It was always like this. The people of the West learned to be suspicious first and to know later, if there was time for it. Peterson opened a thick book on the table and began flipping through the pages with ink-stained fingers. "We have some properties available," Peterson said, adjusting the glasses to his nose. "Most are land on the outskirts of the city, good for agriculture or cattle raising." Hank listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the window that looked out onto the street. He was not interested in fertile land or building an empire. He just wanted a place to be quiet, away from the confusion and trouble that seemed to follow him wherever he went. It was when Peterson mentioned the barn that Hank's ears sharpened. It was a strange property, the manager explained. An old barn built more than 20 years ago by an eccentric farmer named Jonas Wheeling. The man had died the previous winter, with no known family, and the property had been abandoned. The barn was located about 2 miles from the city, in an area that locals avoided for no apparent reason. "The price is symbolic," Peterson said, with a nervous smile. $1. The bank just wants to get rid of the property. No one in the region has shown interest, and frankly, we don't know what to do with it. Hank felt something move in his chest, a curiosity he hadn't felt in a long time. A barn for $1 was more than a strange deal. It was almost a gift. And gifts like this always came with complications. Peterson kept talking about the legal details, but Hank barely listened. His thoughts were already in the abandoned barn, wondering the reasons why no one wanted him. In the West, when people avoided a place, there was usually a good reason for it. It could be superstition, stories invented to ward off curious people, or something very real that they preferred to forget. The sun began to set when Hank finally signed the papers and received the deed to the property. Peterson walked him to the bank door, obviously relieved to have finally gotten rid of that problem. Hank carefully folded the document and tucked it into the inside pocket of his vest. For the first time in months, I felt like I was making the right decision. The next morning, Hank set off toward the barn, guiding his wagon down the dusty road that wound through the dry hills. The path was steeper than he expected, and the vegetation became scarcer as he moved away from the city. When he finally saw the construction on the horizon, he understood why the people of the area avoided it. The barn stood alone in a clearing surrounded by rocks and thorny bushes, like an abandoned sentinel guarding secrets that no one else cared to know. The wood was faded by the sun and battered by the weather, but the structure seemed solid. It was bigger than Hank had imagined, with a high roof and thick walls that promised coolness even on the hottest days. When he got out of the wagon and stepped on the land that now belonged to him for the first time, Hank felt something strange. The silence there was different, deeper than the ordinary silence of the desert. Not even the wind made a noise, as if it avoided touching that place. He walked slowly toward the barn door, each footstep echoing strangely in the still air. The door was locked with a heavy chain and a padlock that looked much newer than the construction. Hank frowned, wondering why an abandoned barn would be locked so carefully. He went around the building, looking for another entrance, but found only small windows covered with boards nailed firmly. It was then that he noticed something that made him stop. On the floor, near the back wall, the earth presented a strange pattern. Some areas were lower than others, as if the soil had been removed and then replaced without much care. Hank knelt down and ran his hand over the earth. It was fluffier than the ground around it, and when she pressed it with her fingers, she felt that she gave way easily. Hank's heart started beating faster. That was not the result of the weather or the rains. Someone had dug there, and it wasn't that long ago. He stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the entire area around the barn with new attention. Other similar stains became visible now that he knew what to look for. The floor around the building was full of small depressions disguised, as if someone had buried things in several different spots. Hank got back into the wagon and grabbed the pickaxe and shovel he always carried with him. If Jonas Wheeling had left something buried on his property, he had the right to find out what it was. After all, now that land belonged to him, along with all its secrets. Hank began digging in the place where the earth seemed most turned, near the northeast corner of the barn. The soil was the surface, baked by the relentless sun, but it soon gave way to a softer, darker layer. With each shovel of earth he removed, a strange sensation grew in him, as if he were desecrating something sacred or digging up problems that should remain forgotten. Sweat ran down his face as the shovel hit something solid. The metallic sound echoed in the still air, making him stop suddenly. Hank wiped the sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand and leaned over the hole he had dug. About 1/2 meter deep, something glowed faintly under the layer of earth that still covered it. He used his hands to carefully remove the remaining soil, revealing what appeared to be a small metal box. The box was heavy and well preserved, protected by a layer of wax that someone had carefully applied before burying it. Hank carried it out of the hole and placed it on the ground, next to the pile of dirt he had removed. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth, he found neatly folded documents and a leather bag that tinkled with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. The documents were property deeds and sales contracts, all signed by Jonas Wheeling. Hank examined them with increasing attention, realizing that they represented transactions made over many years. Jonas was not just an eccentric farmer, as Peterson had suggested. He was a man who had amassed a considerable fortune through carefully planned and precisely executed deals. The leather bag contained more than 100 gold coins, each shining as if it had been freshly polished. Hank had never seen so much gold together in his entire life. His hands weighed the bag, mentally calculating the value of that small fortune. It was enough money to buy land, livestock, build a comfortable house, and live worry-free for the rest of your life. But something about the careful expression with which the documents had been preserved and the meticulous way in which the box had been buried suggested that this was not the whole story. Jonas Wheeling was clearly a man who planned ahead and left nothing to chance. If he had buried one box so carefully, he had probably buried others. Hank put everything back in the box and carried it to his wagon. The sun was already high, and the heat made the work more and more difficult, but he couldn't stop. The discovery of the first box had awakened in him a thirst for knowledge that he had not felt for years. He wanted to understand who Jonas Wheeling really was and why he had chosen to hide his wealth in that way. He chose another place where the earth seemed altered, this time closer to the west wall of the barn. The excavation was more difficult here, as the soil was compacted and full of small stones that caused the shovel to slip. When he finally found something, it was not a box, as he had expected, but a leather bundle tied with thick ropes. The package contained weapons. 2 revolvers of excellent quality, with mother-of-pearl handles and elaborate engravings on the barrels. Along with them were cartridges and a dagger with a thin steel blade that reflected light like a mirror. The weapons were impeccable, obviously cared for by someone who understood their value and importance. Hank examined the revolvers carefully. They were not ordinary farmers' weapons. They were the weapons of a man who knew how to use violence when necessary and who had the resources to acquire the best equipment available. The engravings on the pipes were too intricate to be ornamental. They looked like distinctive marks, perhaps signatures of a famous armorer or symbols that had specific meaning for Jonah. The discovery of the weapons completely changed the image Hank was forming of the barn's former owner. Jonas Wheeling was not just a rich and eccentric farmer. He was a man who had lived a dangerous life, who had amassed wealth through methods that might not have been entirely legal, and who had carefully prepared to hide the evidence of his activities. Hank continued digging until late afternoon, finding 3 more hiding places. In each one, he discovered different aspects of Jonas Wheeling's secret life. One box contained jewelry that clearly belonged to upper-class women, pieces too expensive to be honestly acquired by an isolated farmer. Another kept detailed maps of trade routes and notes on freight train movements and stagecoaches. The most disturbing discovery was a leather notebook, where Jonas had meticulously recorded his activities over nearly 2 decades. The pages revealed the truth about the man who had built the barn. Jonas Wheeling was a highwayman, one of the most successful and careful who had ever operated in that region. His notes described robberies planned with military precision and executed with an efficiency that rarely left witnesses alive. The notebook also revealed why Jonas had chosen to settle near Cedar Ridge. The location was strategic, allowing him to monitor the movement of convoys and stagecoaches passing through the region, plan his attacks, and then disappear into the rugged terrain he knew better than any pursuer. The barn was not just his home, it was his base of operations. As he read, Hank felt a chill grow in his stomach. Jonas had recorded details about victims, stolen quantities, methods used to eliminate witnesses. It was the diary of a man who had turned crime into an exact science and who had prospered through the death and suffering of dozens of innocent people. The last entry in the notebook was dated just 2 weeks before Jonas's death. In it, he mentioned having hidden his greatest discovery inside his own barn, in a place that only he knew. He described this discovery as being valuable enough to warrant a life of luxury anywhere in the world, but also dangerous enough to attract unwanted attention if it was discovered. As the sun began to set, Hank stopped digging and looked at the barn with fresh eyes. The building was not just an abandoned building, it was the heart of a criminal operation that had terrorized the region for years. And somewhere within those faded wooden walls, Jonah had hidden something he considered his most valuable discovery. Hank gathered all the boxes and packages he had found and carried them to his wagon. His mind worked frantically, processing the implications of his discovery. He had bought more than a barn for $1. He had bought the secrets and criminal inheritance of one of the most dangerous outlaws in the West, and now he needed to decide what to do with that knowledge. The drive back to the city seemed longer than in the morning. Hank steered the wagon slowly, his eyes constantly checking if he was being followed. The discovery of Jonas Wheeling's true identity had changed everything. If the people of Cedar Ridge found out what he had found, his life in the town would become impossible. And if other criminals knew about the wealth hidden in the barn, his life would be in danger. When he reached the small room he had rented at the city hotel, Hank carefully locked the door and closed the curtains. He placed all the discoveries on the bed and examined them again by the light of the lamp. Gold alone was worth more money than he had seen in his entire life, but I knew that this was just the beginning. Jonas Wheeling's true treasure was still hidden inside the barn, waiting to be discovered. Hank spent the whole night unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pages of Jonas Wheeling's diary with its meticulous records of violence and death. The gold and jewels scattered on the bed seemed to pulse in the darkness of the room, constantly reminding him that he now possessed the spoils of brutal crimes. When the first ray of sunlight came through the curtain, he was already standing, wearing his work clothes. The trip back to the barn seemed more tense than the day before. Hank constantly checked to see if he was being followed, but the road remained empty. When she arrived at the place, The eerie silence she had noticed on the first day seemed even deeper. It was as if the land itself was mourning the victims of Jonas Wheeling. The padlock that locked the main barn door was sturdy, but Hank had brought him proper tools. He used a lever to force the chain until it broke with a metallic noise that echoed through the silent morning. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed the heavy wooden door, which opened with a prolonged groan of rusty hinges. The first thing he noticed was the smell. It wasn't the usual smell of old wood and dampness that I expected to find. There was something else. A sweet, cloying aroma that made her stomach turn. Hank covered his nose with his shirt sleeve and waited for his eyes to get used to the dim light of the interior. The barn was larger on the inside than it appeared on the outside. The high ceiling disappeared into the shadows, and beams of sunlight poured in through cracks between the planks, creating golden columns that cut through the darkness. In the center of the space, Hank saw something that made him stop suddenly. A wide table of solid wood, stained dark red, with chains and shackles still attached to its edges. Around the table, the dirt floor was dark and uneven. Hank didn't need much imagination to understand what had happened there. Jonas Wheeling didn't just steal his victims, he brought them into the barn, and what he did with them in that secluded place was something his careful records had deliberately omitted. He forced himself to continue exploring, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to get out of there immediately. On the walls, he found metal hooks where equipment had been hung. The floor was covered with a layer of straw that could not completely disguise the dark stains that spread throughout the central area of the barn. It was in a far corner that Hank found what he was looking for. One section of the floor looked different from the rest, with wooden planks neatly fitted where there should have been only rammed earth. When he knelt down and examined more closely, he realized that the boards could be removed. They were loose, held in place only by their own weight and by simple latches that could be opened easily by someone who knew where to look. He removed the planks one by one, revealing a compartment dug into the ground. It was deep, about 5 feet, and carefully lined with stones to prevent cave-ins. Inside the compartment, arranged with the same obsessive care that characterized all of Jonas's hideouts, were objects that made Hank instinctively retreat. Bags of gold and silver coins were piled up against one of the walls of the hideout. There was more wealth there than in all the other hiding places combined. But it wasn't money that caused Hank's growing horror. They were the other objects. Wedding rings, pocket watches, medallions with family portraits, delicate earrings that had belonged to women who probably never returned home. Each object told a story of interrupted life. Hank took a silver locket and opened it, revealing a portrait of a young woman holding a small child. On the other side, an inscription read, "To my dear Thomas with all my love, Sarah." His hands trembled as he put the locket back in place. At the bottom of the compartment, he found what Jonas had described as his greatest discovery. It was a metal-reinforced leather trunk, too heavy to be lifted alone. Hank had to use ropes and levers to hoist him up to ground level. When he finally managed to open the chest, he understood why Jonah considered him so valuable and dangerous. The trunk contained official government documents, including records of troop movements, correspondence between military officials, and detailed maps of routes used to transport federal gold. They were not just the spoils of common crimes. Jonas had managed to intercept sensitive military information, probably through the assassination of official couriers. Among the documents, Hank found something that made him sit heavily on the dirt floor. It was a military order dated 2 months before Jonas's death, authorizing an official investigation into the attacks in the region. The order specifically mentioned the suspicion that a highwayman was operating near Cedar Ridge, and included a detailed description of Jonas Wheeling as the prime suspect. Jonah had known that he was being hunted. The documents in the trunk showed that he had intercepted the orders that sealed his fate. He knew the military was approaching, and he had carefully planned how to hide his riches before fleeing or facing his pursuers. His sudden death the previous winter had been unnatural, as everyone at Cedar Ridge believed. Hank continued to examine the documents and found intercepted personal letters, some still with dried blood staining the paper. One of them, written by a merchant to his wife, described the route he planned to take with a valuable cargo of goods. The letter was dated just 3 days before an entry in Jonah's diary that described a particularly lucrative raid. Late in the afternoon, when he finished mentally cataloguing everything he had found, Hank sat on the threshold of the barn door and looked out over the desolate landscape around him. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky red, a color that now made him think about things he would rather forget. He possessed a fortune that could change his life forever. Enough gold, silver, jewelry, and valuable objects to live comfortably for the rest of your days. But every coin, every jewel, every precious object was stained with the blood of innocent people who had only made the mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The discovery of the military documents further complicated the situation. If authorities discovered that he had stolen confidential information, he would be treated as an accomplice of Jonas Wheeling. It wouldn't matter that he had bought the property legally and discovered it all by chance. In the West, justice was not always concerned with subtle details. Hank ran his hand over his tired face and made a decision that he knew was risky, but necessary. He couldn't just take the wealth and run away. The personal effects of the victims deserved to be returned to their families, if there were still families to receive them. And military documents needed to be handed over to the competent authorities, regardless of the consequences for him. But before he could do anything, he needed to ensure his own safety. If anyone discovered what he had found before he could take proper action, his life would be worth no more than that of any of Jonas Wheeling's victims. The barn had kept its secrets for too long, and Hank knew there were people they would kill to keep those secrets buried forever. When darkness finally engulfed the barn, Hank put the planks back in place and left, carefully locking the door behind him. Tomorrow, he would make the decisions that would define not only his future, but also his ability to live with himself. For now, she needed to carefully plan every move, because she knew her life depended on the choices she would make in the next few hours. Hank spent 3 days carefully planning every move. He knew that a rash decision could cost him his life, but he also couldn't carry the weight of Jonas Wheeling's secrets alone. On the morning of the 4th day, he put on his best clothes and went to the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's office. Sheriff William Crawford was a middle-aged man with a grey mustache and eyes that had seen enough of human nature not to be easily surprised. She received Hank with professional courtesy, but her expression changed completely when Hank began to tell her story. At first, Crawford seemed skeptical, but when Hank placed some of the jewelry on his desk, along with carefully selected pages from Jonas's diary, skepticism gave way to intense attention. Crawford examined the objects in silence for several minutes. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the medallion with the portrait of the woman and child. Hank realized that the sheriff recognized some of the items, likely from missing persons reports he had received over the years. "We always knew there was something wrong in that area," Crawford said finally, his voice heavy with heavy sadness. "People disappeared too often to be a coincidence. But Jonas Wheeling seemed just like an eccentric farmer. We never imagined he would be capable of something like that." The sheriff looked up at Hank, studying his face carefully. "The question now is, what do we do with this information?" Hank had anticipated this question and was prepared. He explained that he wanted to return all personal effects to the families of the victims, if possible, and hand over the military documents to the competent federal authorities. As for gold and silver, he suggested that they be used to compensate families who had lost loved ones, recognizing that no amount of money could truly repair their losses. Crawford watched him with an expression that mixed surprise and respect. It was rare to find someone willing to give up a fortune in the name of justice. He agreed to help Hank contact the victims' families and the military authorities, but warned that the process would be long and possibly dangerous. There was always the possibility that other criminals would know of Jonas's hiding places and come looking for them. Over the next few weeks, Crawford and Hank worked together to identify Jonas Wheeling's victims. It was a painful and painstaking process. Each personal object was compared with missing persons reports, and slowly the identities of the victims were revealed. The locket belonged to Sarah Thompson, who had disappeared 3 years earlier, along with her husband and young son, while traveling to reunite with relatives in California. The Thompson family had lived in the hope that their loved ones were just lost somewhere, perhaps building a new life in uncharted territory. The notification of their death was devastating, but it also brought a kind of painful closure that allowed them to finally begin the proper grieving process. One by one, other families were contacted. Some had moved far away, trying to forget their losses. Others still lived in the area, sustained by the growing hope that their loved ones would someday return. For all of them, the news was a brutal blow, but also an answer to the questions that had plagued them for years. The most difficult of all was contacting the family of Marcus Rodriguez, a young soldier whose military ring was among the objects found. Marcus had been killed while transporting confidential military mail, and his death had been attributed to an attack by hostile Indians. Discovering that he had been tortured and murdered by Jonas Wheeling, and that his letters had been used to plan other attacks, brought renewed grief to his elderly parents. Military authorities took the discovery of the classified documents very seriously. A detachment of soldiers was sent to examine the barn and confirm Hank's findings. The captain in charge of the investigation, a stern man named Morrison, interrogated Hank extensively about how he had found the documents and why he had decided to turn them over to the authorities. Morrison was clearly suspicious of Hank's motivations, but he could not find any inconsistencies in his story. Hank's decision to voluntarily hand over such valuable and compromising information was unusual enough to be convincing. No one who was involved in Jonah's crimes would have had reason to expose evidence that could incriminate him. After weeks of investigation, authorities confirmed that Jonas Wheeling had been responsible for the disappearance of at least 15 people over 2 decades. His methods were as brutal as they were efficient, and his ability to avoid detection had been almost supernatural. The discovery of the barn finally explained mysteries that had haunted the region for years. Hank used his share of the gold he found to buy a small plot of land on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge and build a modest house. It was not a luxurious life, but it was honest and allowed him to sleep peacefully. The rest of the fortune was distributed among the families of the victims, providing at least some financial relief to those who had lost their family's primary breadwinners. The barn was burned in a public ceremony held 6 months after the discovery of Jonas's crimes. The families of the victims were present, and many of them personally thanked Hank for giving them the chance to finally find peace. As the flames consumed the wooden structure that had sheltered so much pain and suffering, Hank felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Years later, when the people of Cedar Ridge talked about the events of that period, they always mentioned the integrity of Hank Miller. In a region where many men would have kept the fortune and kept the secrets buried, he had chosen to do the right thing, regardless of the personal cost. His decision had brought justice to the dead and peace to the living. Hank lived the rest of his life as a respected man in the community. He married a local widow, helped raise his children, and became known for his generosity to those in need. He never talked about the details of what he had found in the barn, but everyone knew that he had done something extraordinary in choosing justice over personal wealth. On Jonas Wheeling's tombstone in the local cemetery, there was no epitaph, just his name and the dates of birth and death. It was all that deserved to be remembered of a man who had dedicated his life to causing suffering to others. The real tombstone for their victims was the memory of their families and the justice that had finally been served on their behalf. The land where the barn had stood remained empty for many years. Grass grew on the ashes, and eventually wildflowers began to sprout at the site. It was as if the earth itself was trying to heal the wounds that Jonas Wheeling had left, and in a way, maybe it was. Hank often walked to that spot at dusk, especially on the anniversaries of the discoveries. He did not go there to mourn or relive the horrors he had encountered. He was going to remind himself that he had made the right choice, and that sometimes an ordinary person can make the difference between justice and the perpetuation of evil. The sun from the west continued to set over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky the same colors as always. But now, when the golden light touched the spot where the barn had stood, there were no more dark shadows hiding terrible secrets. There was only peace, and the silent memory of 15 souls who had finally found the justice they deserved. If this story of courage and justice has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures of the American Wild West. Subscribe to the channel and leave your comment below telling us what was the most emotional moment of this story for you. Was it when Hank discovered the true identity of Jonas Wheeling, when he found the personal effects of the victims?